The purpose of this lesson is to learn how to use a selection statement, what a single alternative and dual alternative statement is, and how to use a case statement. Many times our programs need to learn to make decisions. And the way that we do this is by using what are called selection statements. So the selection statement is going to allow the program to make a decision to decide if something should happen or not. And it's always based on some sort of a decision that determines if a conditional statement is true. Now, it is possible for us to use a not keyword to determine if something is the opposite of true, but the system will always look to see if something is true. The first type is a single alternative statement. It's called an if and if statement. So in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to specify if some condition is true, then we're going to do something, and then we end if. So if this is true, this do something will actually work. But if this is not true, then it just simply skips right over the do something and goes on to the next section of code. The next type is an if, else, and if statement, which is what's called a dual alternative statement. And what that means is that if the condition is true, then we're going to do something. Else, meaning the condition was not true, then we do something else, and then we end. So in a dual alternative statement, one or the other of these two things is going to run. If the condition is true, this one runs, but this one does not. If the condition is false, this one does not run, but this one down here does. And then it goes on to the next section of code. We also have what's called an if, else, and if statement. So it's called an if, else, if statement for short. These are dual alternative statements with more than one possible outcome. All right, so what this means is that I can say if the condition is true, then we're going to do something. But if it's not true, then we're going to try to evaluate another condition. So what we'll say is, if it's true, do this. But if it's not true, let's see if this one's true. And if it is, then we do this. And then we always end our if, else, if statements with else. So this will run as a last case thing that happens. Sometimes our if, else, and if statements get too complex and cumbersome. It makes it really hard to troubleshoot, makes it really hard to code. We can't really follow along with what we're doing. So what we can use instead is what's called a case statement. Now, a case statement can be used to reduce complexity. However, each thing in a case statement must somehow be related. So what I mean by that is if I'm looking at a range of cells, what I can do is things like if this cell is less than 100, then we're going to color it red. If the cell is between 100 and 200, then we color it yellow, and so forth. Well, what we can do is instead of using if, else statements to do those, we can just simply have a case statement, but all three of those somehow have to be related to each other. Cases can also account for ranges more easily than selection statements. So if I want to say if the number is between 1 and 30, then we do something. If it's between 31 and 50, we do something. If it's between 51 and 60, we do something, and so forth. So we actually can account for these ranges of numbers. Case statements are much easier to read, and they're easier to troubleshoot than very complex if statements. I've created a new workbook, and I'm opened up the VBA, and what I want to do is I'm going to make a new sub, and we're going to call it selection statements. All right, now this sub is going to be where I'm going to make some decisions based on things that are in our spreadsheet. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to type some numbers over here, and let's start with, let's say 15. Maybe these are values for scores on a test or something. So we'll go ahead and make some scores up real quick. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I want to look at each of these scores, and we're going to list if it's a good score or not. All right, so anything that's an A is going to be anything from 90 to 100. We'll have B's, which would be anything from 80 to 90. We have some C's, we'll have some D's, and then we'll have some F's. And so what I want to do is I want to specify if one of these is between 90 and 100, or actually 90 or greater because somebody could get extra credit, then it's going to be an A. Otherwise, if it's from 80 to 90, then it's a B, and so forth. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to write the code that will allow me to look at these values and figure out whether or not these grades are A's, B's, C's, D's, or F's. I'm going to start this by coding it the long way, and then we're going to start to shorten it. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to make an if statement. I'm going to say if the value of A1, now remember I can say range of A1 like this, or I could do the shorthand version by simply saying A1. So I'm going to do this. All right, so if A1 dot value is greater than 90, then we're going to do something. And so what we're going to do is we're going to say that B1 dot value is equal to B. Oops. Sorry, greater than 90 would be an A. Okay, and then what we have to do is we have to say and if. All right, now the problem is this value here right now is 15. So let's go ahead and change this to 95 just so that you can see what it looks like if it's an A. All right, so if the value of A1 is greater than 90, then we're going to take B1 and set its value to A. So go ahead and run this. All right, so we got our A. All right, but now what we have to do is we have to look at it. Well, if the value of A1 isn't greater than 90, then it's a B. All right, so what I'm going to do is instead of saying and if here, I'm going to add to this. And so what I could do is I could do something like else, let's do B1 dot value equals less than A. We'll get to actually putting the scores in a minute. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to change this to a 65 and then go back to our code here. And so if A1 is greater than 90, then it's an A. Otherwise, it's going to be less than A. So run this. Now it's less than A. All right, now that's not what I really want it to do. I want it to say if it's greater than 90, then it's an A. Else if it's greater than 80 but less than 90, it's a B. Well, here's the nice thing is that I already know that if it wasn't greater than 90 up here, I don't have to reevaluate if it's less than 90. Because I already know it's not greater than 90, therefore it has to be less than 90. So I only have to say something like else if A1 dot value is greater than 80, then, and then now what we're going to say is B1 dot value is equal to B. Okay, now I can keep going. I can say else if A1 dot value is greater than 70, because if it wasn't greater than 90 and it wasn't greater than 80, then it has to be somewhere less than 80. So now if it's greater than 70, oh, I forgot the word then, then we're going to take B1 dot value and we're going to set that equal to C. Okay, else if A1 dot value is greater than 60. So if it wasn't greater than 90, if it wasn't greater than 80, if it wasn't greater than 70, well, now we're checking to see if it's greater than 60. Then, and we're going to say B1 dot value is equal to D. And then finally, we're going to say else, otherwise it must be an F. So we're going to change this from less than A to this. All right, so if it's greater than 90, then the value of B1 is going to be A. Else if, so if it's not greater than 90, we'll check to see is it greater than 80 at least, then it's a B. Okay, if not, then is it greater than 70? Then it's a C. If not, then is it greater than 60? Then it would be a D. Otherwise, if it wasn't greater than any of these, then they must have gotten an F. So what this does is this allows us to go through and look to see what the score in this one particular field is to figure out what the grade should be over here. All right, so if I actually run this, now it says we got a D. Okay, I got a 65. So if I go ahead and change this to an 86, go back, run it. Oh, I didn't press enter. All right, so go ahead and run it. And now our grade changed to a B. So what it does for us is it allows us to evaluate for that one cell. All right, so I want to reproduce this for A2. All right, so let's go to A2. All right, so it's going to look an awful lot like this. So I'm just simply going to copy this. And I'm going to come down here and I'm going to paste it. And then now where this says A1, I'm going to change this to A2. And then this is going to be A2. This is A2, A2, and so forth. All right, so now when I run this, it'll figure out what our score is for A1 and A2, except I left these accidentally as B1, so these go to B2. B2. Okay, so let's fix that. There we go. So now we got our B and our A. All right, now I need to do that for the next one. And we're going to cut and paste this and do this over and over and over and over. And hey, that sounds like something where we would use a loop. Remember, our loops allow us to get rid of repetitive processes. So I don't want this to be a loop. So what you'll notice here is that our value for the location that we're trying to evaluate and the location for where we actually rate the score change. All right, so A1 is the location that we want. And then what we want to do is we want to look at the cell to the right of it and set its value. Well, that sounds like an offset. So what we can do is we can specify the cell that we want. And let's get rid of this stuff so we can condense this a little bit. So I want to look at the cell, and then I want to look at the cell to the right. I want to look at its offset. So what we can do is we can start condensing this a little bit and get rid of that B1 reference. All right, so instead of being B1, I'm going to call this A1, and then I want to look at the offset. So dot offset, and then where do I want to look at for the offset? Now remember, we can use our shortcut, and I don't want to change the row, so I'm not going to put a value for the first number, but I do want to look at the next column. So I'm going to do something like this. And so now what this will do is it allow me to look at A1, offset 1 to the right, and set its value to A. All right, so we can take this and replace all of our B1 references with that same number, or that same statement. So I'm just going to go through here and replace all of my B1s. All right, so now what we're doing is we're looking at A1's value. If it's greater than 90, we're going to go A1, offset 1 to the right, and set its value to A. And do the same thing for all these. So now I've actually gotten rid of my B1 reference. All right, let's go ahead and run it. And we set it to B. Now we didn't actually get to see it do anything because it was still the same value. So type in a new number, so we should have an F now. And so now we have an F. All right, so now what I can do is I can go a little bit further, and instead of saying that we're referencing A1, we can go with our cells reference instead. Okay, so what I can do is I can say cells, and then where am I looking at? Well, I'm looking at 1, 1. All right, so if I want to look at 1, 1, that's row 1, column 1. And now what I can do is I can replace all of my A1 references with cells 1, 1. Okay, so I'm going to go through and replace all of these. Okay, so now they're all replaced with a cells reference. Sorry about that. So now by doing this, what this allows me to do is this looks like something that I could automate with a loop. All right, so let's try it to make sure that this works. So we're going to put this to a 78. Press enter, so it'll let me actually do it. And let's go ahead and run it. And now we have a C. So I didn't change where I'm evaluating the number. I didn't change where I'm setting the score. I've simply changed how I reference it. So I'm referencing the cell by its row and column, and I'm referencing the offset of one column to the right to set the value for the score. All right, so now I know that my column is going to remain as 1 because these are A columns. All right, but what I want to do is I want to change our value here to be the row that we're actually trying to evaluate. Well, that sounds like something that I could replace with a variable, say I. So if I go through all of these and look at I, all right, so I'm just simply going through every one of these, and every place I had cells, I replace it with I. All right, now I need an I though, so what I have to do is I have to dimension I, and dimension I is an integer, and we're going to set I is equal to 1. All right, so we start off with I is equal to 1, and then we can go through and actually look at this and see what the value is. So it's the same things we had before. We run it, we get the exact same thing. So if I change this value to 65 and press enter, and go over here and run it, then that changes our score. So what I'm doing is I'm getting closer and closer to making a loop out of this. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a for loop. Now in this case, I know that there are 10 scores, so I'm going to say for I is equal to 1 to 10. All right, now I'm leaving my declaration above for it. And the reason I'm doing that is I want to make a change to this in a little bit. But what we're going to do is we're going to do next I, and I'm going to take every one of these and just simply indent it. Oops, I want to use tab. The reason I'm indenting these is it makes it a lot easier to troubleshoot later when something isn't working right. All right, so we now have all of our values here that are indented, and it makes it easier to troubleshoot, and we can actually see what everything is. All right, so now what I'm going to do is I'm telling it that for I is equal to 1 to 10, go through and do this. So now what it's going to do is it's going to increment I when it goes through all of these, and it will actually check the score for every one of these values, and it will place a grade beside it. So what it's doing is simply, instead of me having a whole bunch of if statements for every single record that we have, we just simply automated the process. What if I want to automate this just a little bit further? And what I mean by that is I may not necessarily know that there are exactly 10 scores in here. And by doing this, for saying for I is equal 1 to 10, I know exactly how many are in here. But what if there were 20 scores or 50 scores? Well, then I'd have to change this every time. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a new variable to try to figure out where the last record is, or actually figure out how many records there are. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to dim a new variable, and I'm going to call it numRows. And I'm going to set this as an integer. And then I'm going to set numRows equal to a special count. Okay, so what I'm going to do is ActiveSheet dot used range dot rows dot count. So what we're doing is we're telling it on the active sheet, whatever the used range is, how many rows there are, count them. And then what we're going to do is we're going to set this that for I is equal to 1 to the num rows, which actually it was supposed to be num rows, which is why it's getting an error. All right, so I'm going to go back and change this to numRows. So numRows is going to be equal to ActiveSheet.UsedRange.Rows.Count. And so we're going to simply count how many rows there are, and then from 1 to however many rows we have, we're going to go ahead and perform the calculations. All right, so if I go ahead and add some more scores over here, and so forth, now when I go back and go to my code, and I run this, now to go through and put a score for all of them. So it simply just counts how many scores we have, and then puts that into numRows and keeps track of it. So now it doesn't matter how many scores I put in here, it'll automatically figure out how many scores there are, and it will put the grade letter beside the score. I want to get a little bit more creative, and I want to color code the scores that the user received. So if they received an A, we're going to make it green, and then we're going to go all the way down to if they get an F, it's going to be red. All right, so for me to do that, I could make some more if-then statements, but instead I want to get a little creative and I want to make some case statements. So I'm going to make a new sub down here, and I'm going to call it color scores. And so now we have a new subroutine down here where we can actually start putting in our case statements. All right, so what I want to do is I want to look at the particular rows, and it's actually going to function almost identically to this if-then statement up here. So I'm going to take all of the code from up here, including all the way up through declaring our I, and I'm just simply going to paste it down here in our new section. Now the thing is that this letter I, this variable, it is a separate variable from one sub to the next. So if I dimension I down here, this is a completely separate I versus the one that's up above. Now we're still going to use our for loop that's here, but I'm going to get rid of our if statements. All right, and what I'm going to do inside of here instead is I'm going to use a select case. So I'm going to select a case, and what I'm doing is I'm still going to look at our cells, and I'm still looking at I, 1. So just like we did before, and I want to look at the value. So what I'm telling the system is look at the value of the currently selected cell, and then we're going to select from a list below what we should do with it based on what that value is. All right, so our case statement, I'm going to indent again, and I'm going to say case, and this time I'm going to say A. So instead of saying if the score is greater than a certain number, then I'm going to give it a grade. I'm actually going to look at the score. And I just realized, actually, I want this to be column 2 because we're looking at the B1, B2, B3, and so forth column. All right, so the case for an A is going to be this. And what we're going to do is we're going to say cells, whoops, and then we're going to do I, 2, so whatever one we're on right now, dot font dot color, and then what I want to do is I want to specify the RGB value for this. All right, so if they got an A, I want it to be 84 and then 214 103. Sorry, it's font colors equal to, and that's an RGB value. All right, so anyhow, what we're going to do is we're going to specify that that's what they should have if it's an A. Okay, then we're going to go back and we're going to make a case for B, and we're going to set the cells I, 2, dot font dot color, and we're going to set that equal to RGB, and then this time we're going to do 168, 214, 192. I just picked some colors before on a color picker. And then now we're going to do a case for C, I, 2, just like before, dot font dot color is equal to RGB. And this time I'm going to do 212, 214, 84. And then the next one's going to be case is D, and this one's going to be cells I, 2, so they all look about the same, dot font dot color is equal to RGB, and then this time we're going to do 255, 0, 0, so we want it to be pure red. Okay, so now what I did was I did all the cases for A through D, but I didn't specify anything for F yet. And the reason for it is if it's not an A, not a B, not a C, or a D, it must be an F or something else. And so what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to say case else. And then no matter what it is, anything other than an A, B, C, or D, then it'll be formatted I, 2, dot, and I'm sorry, this is supposed to be our red because the D is not red, it's an orange color. So we'll fix that one in just a second. RGB 255, 0, 0. This is pure red. And then the orange here was supposed to be 252, and then 166, and then 18. All right, so what I'm doing is I'm just simply saying that if it's an A, we're going to color this green color. If it's a B, it'll be this greenish bluish color. If it's a C, it'll be this yellowish color. If it's a D, it's going to be this orangey color. And if it's anything else, then we're going to color this red. And then the last line here is that we need to end our select statement. So this functions a lot like an if-then statement, because what I could do is I could say if cells 1, 2 dot value is equal to A, then do this. But notice I have a lot less typing here. I only have to tell it the cell that we have to evaluate one time, and then the system will look through this list to see which one of these matches the value of that particular cell at that point. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and run this section of code, and it goes through and it color codes these based on what letter score we have. All right, so the first section of code is responsible for figuring out the letters. The second section of code is responsible for figuring out the color to make the letters. And you'll notice we have A's are green, B is this bluish greenish color, C is this yellowish color, D is orange, and our F's are bright red. So it color codes it, makes it real easy to see what color they are, and we can just look at it very quickly and figure out what grades everybody has. So the case statements, like I said, we could do those all as if-then statements, but a case statement is easier to write and it's easier to troubleshoot. In this lesson, you learned how to use a selection statement. You learned the different types of statements that you can use, such as just if and end if statements. We have if and else statements. We have if, else if, and else statements. And then you also learned the difference between a single alternative, that's our if then, and then end. And then our dual alternative, that's going to be our if and else if. And you also learned how to use a case statement to make selections instead of using if statements.